Kiev Rus was this nation in Eastern Europe that was basically a confederation of tribal states. A lot of tribes got together and said, okay, we're going to have a king, we're going to band together, we're going to be together, be one nation, and they called themselves Kiev Rus. And their king at the time was a king by the name of Igor, which I think is nice because we think of Igor as a hunchback guy who helps a mad scientist. And it's nice to think that Igor was at once a very regal name, sort of name you would give your child as you wanted him to grow up to be a king. So there was King Igor, and his wife was the queen, and her name was Olga. And Olga had been a Viking princess. Well, King Igor... Why? Something with the nations, I'm sure, I don't know, it was food supply or military or something, but he decided he needed to raise taxes. And King Igor was an extremely principled man. He was a king, he was a good king, he was somebody who cared for those whom he ruled over. And so he decided what he would do is he would go and he would look face to face each tribe. The leaders of each tribe, the elders of each tribe, the government of each tribe, the capital cities, he would go to each tribe and he would explain to them the situation. He would explain why he needed to raise taxes, and he would give them an opportunity to ask him any questions and make sure that they knew what he was doing and that they were all on the same page and that everyone was happy. And for most of the people, it worked great. But there was a group of people called the Drevlians. And the Drevlians were a tribe within Kiev Rus, and they did not like taxes. And so when the king said, hey, I need to raise taxes, they said, I don't think we want to do that. And he tried to convince them of the way that things were going to be, and he tried to explain to them what was going on. He tried to help them to see what was happening. But they could not come to peace. They could not come to terms. And so the Drevlians murdered King Igor. And with Igor out of the picture, that left a power vacuum in Kiev Rus. Now the trouble was, the Drevlians immediately looked and said, we can fill that power vacuum. That could be us. We could do that. The trouble is, everybody loved the Viking princess turned queen of Kiev Rus, Olga. The military had her back. The other tribes had her back. And so the Drevlians decided the only way that they were going to gain power, that they were going to gain a foothold, was if they could have their prince marry Queen Olga. And then they would take the throne, they would have the power, consolidate everything together, and they would have centuries of a Drevlian rule in Kiev Rus. Now what they had not counted on was the very simple fact that Viking princesses are a little different than most princesses. And so the story doesn't really play out the way one might expect when it comes to a woman on a throne 1,000 years ago or so, and a group of tribesmen and important people attempting to take that throne. So what happened first was the Drevlians went ahead and sent about 20 ambassadors to go and present this offer to Queen Olga. An offer of marriage. They would wine her, they would dine her, they would try to persuade her that the best way of action moving forward was marriage. Olga heard their proposal. She thought it through, and she gave them her answer, which was she dug a trench and buried the 20 men alive in it. And so it began. Nobody knew what had happened other than, the soldiers and these 20 men who, they had bad memories now. And so the Drevlians have no idea. So Olga went ahead and sent her own ambassadors back and said, I agree to your terms of marriage. What we need to do is hammer out a legal contract. So if you could send all of your nobles and aristocrats to me, then I'll go ahead and we'll hammer out the details. We'll get this right going. And so the Drevlians, thinking, oh, great, not knowing that their ambassadors were buried alive, went ahead and sent their finest nobles, their finest aristocrats, again, thinking this was going to go well for them. And they went on the journey, and they landed in the capital of Kiev Rus, where the queen was. And then they'd been on horseback, and the queen said, listen, we're going to get right down to business. We're going to go ahead and hammer out a contract. But you guys are a little smelly from your trip. I understand. You're grown men. You're going to sweat a little bit. So why don't you guys go take a bath in our beautiful, lovely bathhouse? And when you're finished, we'll sit down and have dinner and work things out. And so the Drevlians, having no idea who they were dealing with at all, said, okay, yeah, they all went to go take a bath in the bathhouse. At which point, Olga locked the doors, lit them on fire, and burned all the men alive. So that was step 2 of her response to marriage. So then she decided, okay, well, I've gotten rid of their ambassadors. I've gotten rid of their noblemen. Nobody can lead them. Let's just make double sure that I haven't missed anybody. So she sent another message. She said, listen, your ambassadors, they're great. Those nobles you sent, they're really great too. Could you go ahead and send your army to me? And what we'll do is we're going to sit down. We're going to have a feast. I'm going to throw a feast. It's going to be in honor of my late husband because I loved him so. And also in honor of our future, partnership of the Drevlians and the house of Igor. What we'll do is we'll have a feast. So if you can just send your fighting men. And the Drevlians, having no idea who they were dealing with, having no idea what she had done already, went ahead and sent 5,000 or so troops to the capital city. And they had a feast, a wonderful feast, where everybody was drinking, except for all of Olga's soldiers. You see, the Drevlian soldiers, they got alcohol, and a lot of it. And the soldiers of Olga, they got water. So as the night progressed, and the alcohol started to take effect, the soldiers from the Drevlians, they were a little sloppy drunk, and stone cold sober were all of Olga's men. And so she said, while they're all here drunk, let's just slaughter them all. And she wiped out in one evening the entire fighting force of the Drevlians. Now at this point, it's a little bit overkill to do anything else. But Olga was a Viking princess. And I don't know if you know anything about the Vikings, but they don't really half-heartedly do much. So Olga decided they don't have an army. They don't have any aristocrats or nobles. Their ambassadors are buried in the ground. I'm going to go ahead and march on the capital city now with my army and explain to them the way taxes are going to work from now on. And so she did. She brought her army to the front gates of the capital city of the Drevlians. And the people at this point realized what has happened. They have no army. They have no one to really negotiate for them anymore. So the elders of the city, at this point, ask for a truce, which is just precious that at this point they would ask for a truce. But Olga was kind, and she said, okay, I'll give you a truce, but what I need from you is what my husband asked. I need taxes. She said, but I'm a little different than my husband. I don't want money. She said, I'm really into birds this year. It's a Viking thing. I like birds. I need 6 birds from every family. I don't care where you get them. Go, into the forest. Go to the nest. Go to wherever. I need you guys to get me 6 birds apiece. Bring me 6 birds, and then we will have a truce. And the Drevlians, they really don't have a choice. So each family went and got 6 birds and brought them to Olga. And Olga, with what was tens of thousands of birds, gave the birds to her troops. They tied rags to the feet of the birds, lit the rags on fire, and sent the birds on their way. And the birds, who, for the record, were totally innocent in this whole thing, the birds did the only thing they knew how to do, which was go home. And so with fire attached to them, the birds went back to their home in the capital city, and it didn't take long until the capital city was on fire, and the people were trying to escape the city, and she slaughtered them one by one killing each and every one of them except for the city elders, whom she decided to make an example of. The city elders who were behind this whole plot for the throne, she went ahead and captured, enslaved, and gave as presents to the other leaders of the other tribesmen as both a, hey, here's what you get if you're on my side, but also this is what's going to happen if you're not on my side. And in the most shocking part of this whole story, all the other tribes decided at that point, maybe no one else wanted to challenge Olga for the throne. And so Olga was declared not just the queen of Kiev Rus, but she was declared queen regent of Kiev Rus. And she reigned as the leader of the nation for decades to come. Now, I tell you this story for a few reasons. The first reason is Game of Thrones ended a couple weeks ago, and I know that like more than a few of you guys are just jonesing for some Game of Thrones. Like, you guys are, like, there's withdrawals going on, like physical, like your skin is itchy. I get it. Like, you just need more. And Olga, Queen Olga is, I mean, if you've watched the show, she's basically like Daenerys and Cersei put together. And like that story is essentially what George Martin would have written. Not the HBO guys, but George Martin would have written that. And so I just figured, throw you guys a bone, scratch that itch a little bit. The second reason is I think the story is instructive to us about the way that we feel about ethics. I will confess that as I was reading this story for the very first time, I thought Olga was awesome. I mean, like, really. Like, some of you guys might not admit it, but like Olga sounds like if there was a movie about Olga, she'd be the good guy, Like she's basically rated R Wonder Woman, right? Like she is essentially the hero. Like we can think like, oh man, she's a victim here. These people try to take her throne, and she put them in their place. She is the quintessential hero of the type of stories we tell as people who tell stories. And yet, Olga's kind of terrible. I mean, really, like, we might think as we look back and we think, oh man, it's super cool how she did this, and, she kept outwitting people, and, she kept doing stuff in amazing ways, like the bird thing was awesome, and, the unwittingly getting the guys to, all go into one house she could burn down. I mean, getting the guys drunk and slaughtering them. I mean, that was good. Like, we think that's good. We feel like that's, good tactics, or we think that, she's this amazing, cool character. At least I do. But the truth is, if you compare her ethics to the ethics of Jesus, they couldn't be further apart. And they just couldn't be. Think about this from the perspective of, the people of the Drevlians who were not part of the coup to take the throne. I mean, she killed everybody. She wiped them all out. I mean, there was innocent women and children in that city, among those people, among that tribe who didn't do anything. They had no idea what was going on. They were just, they wake up one day and somebody's asking for some birds, and they think, okay, I'll go with some birds. Or think of that from the perspective of the soldiers. I mean, there were thousands of soldiers. I don't know exactly how militaries work, I will admit, but it feels like, a lot of the soldiers don't always know what's going on at the top level. And at the very least, even if they know, it's not like they have a say in it. The guy she slaughtered, she got drunk and slaughtered, or lit on fire, or buried in the ground. Those guys were, in a lot of ways, innocent. And if nothing else, think of the birds. That's like animal cruelty. That's you've got a sociopath on your hand when they're torturing animals. She ordered the torture of how many birds. Olga is a maniac. We might root for her in a movie, or if we're watching Game of Thrones, we would say, oh man, she's awesome, she's cool, but she's a maniac. She's not a good person. And I will confess that as I read this story, I'm taking her side. I am inside cheering for her. And that just shows that, we're real bad at determining what is right and what is wrong. As people, we're just real bad at it. We have to be humble enough to say, okay, if I was to decide what is right and wrong and righteous and virtuous and ethical, I'm going to do some things that are real dumb. If I'm going to decide on my own in a vacuum what is right and wrong, I'm going to do it poorly. We should at least admit that. And I think the story, at least for me, really spoke to that truth. But the third reason I'm telling this story is Olga, Viking princess turned queen regent of Kiev Rus. She's actually Saint Olga. Really, she's a saint. As the story progresses, we learn that 10, 15 years after she takes the throne for herself, after all this stuff, Olga went on a diplomatic trip to Constantinople, the center of Christianity in the world at the time. And when she was there, for the very first time, she met Christians. For the very first time, she met people who believed in this Jesus fella. This, they say, is the Son of God, the Word made flesh, the Word of God, the exact representation of God. They believe in this guy who spoke mercy and love and compassion and grace and peace. And she heard that for the very first time. She never met a Christian. She never heard the gospel. And on that trip, literally, without even really considering it, she says, I want that. That's something my life is missing. That's something I've never had. That's a peace and a contentment and a joy I've never felt. And so she asked, what can I do? And she repented, and she turned her back on who she used to be, and she was baptized on that trip, and she became a Christian, the very first Christian in Eastern Europe at that point in history, in that part of the world, the very first one. And she went back, and she tried so hard to evangelize her people, and they didn't want to hear it. Because she was this Viking princess turned queen regent. She was this bloodthirsty maniac. That's who was their queen. And now she's talking about peace and mercy and love and grace, and she's talking about these things, and they just say, oh, she must have lost her mind on the road to Constantinople. And it didn't happen in her lifetime, but eventually she had a grandson, and her grandson was named Vladimir. And while her son was off fighting wars, her grandson and the grandson of Igor, she shared the gospel with him. And he was baptized. And eventually that was the introduction of Christianity to what is modern-day Russia, Poland, Belarus, Romania. Billions of Christians because of Vladimir, because of Olga. Olga, a genocidal maniac, was forgiven and accepted and loved. And she shared the gospel with virtually an entire continent. Now, that's Christianity. And I know we don't always like it. I mean, one of the things you always say is, people love grace when it's for them. But when it's for somebody else, grace doesn't always sound like a good idea, But in Olga, who's canonized as a saint among our Catholic brothers and sisters, our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters, Olga is a woman who was the exact antithesis of Jesus. I mean, you can't get more opposite of Jesus Christ than destroying and wiping out like a bloodline of people. Genocide is you really can't get worse than genocide, and at least opposite of Jesus. And yet, she was accepted, and yet she was changed, and yet God used her in a powerful way to impact billions of people for centuries. And that's the gospel. You see, this idea that God would accept people and love people and forgive people and show people mercy who are the worst of the worst of the worst, and then use them to help people. It's a scandalous, radical truth that no one is beyond the grace of God. No one is beyond the love of God. And it's the sort of thing where, regular sinners like you and I who don't commit genocide, well, God can love the genocidal sociopathic maniac. Well, God probably loves you and me too. And it brings us to a place where we can understand that the hope of Christianity all comes down to our trust in the love of God. You see, for the last several weeks, we've been talking about who it is that God is at his core. We've been talking in a series called A Strange God and a Strange People. We've talked about what it is that makes God holy, what it is that makes God different. And what makes God holy, what makes God different, what makes God strange is the fact that God is love. And as we've been discussing, what that means is that God cannot act towards us in a way that is unloving, because God cannot be anything but loving. He can't help but be loving, because God is at his core love. And so we've been discussing what that means on a tangible level, what it actually means, because you can talk about love being in all sorts of ways, but we've been talking about how love is certain things, and therefore God is certain things. We've talked about whatever love is, that's what God is. And we've been basing all this conversation on the famous love passage in 1 Corinthians. We've been reading this for the last few weeks. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We read this about love and about God. That God must be patient. And we put all those negative things together, and we said that you can kind of sum that up by the word control. And God does not demand his own way out of jealousy or rudeness or all of that. So if love does not control and God is not love, then that means that God does not control. And this morning we're introduced to a new idea. That love does not keep a record of wrongs. Love is not irritable. And therefore, if God is love, God, because he is not irritable, does not keep a record of wrongs. In other words, God does not define us by our very worst moments or our very darkest days. God does not look at you and say the worst thing you've done is what defines you and is what encapsulates who you are as a person. God is better than that. God looks at your record of wrongs and he forgets it. And he forgives it. And I don't want to miss this. I don't want to gloss over this. If all we said, like if this sermon ended now, that's enough for a day where we can reflect on what is essentially a miracle. You see, because we live in a world where people are defined by their worst moments. Where people, very often you think about them and you think about them in terms of their mistakes. We keep records of wrongs constantly. We do it to other people, and we sure as heck do it to ourselves. And yet if love keeps no record of wrongs, and God is love, then that's not how God operates. It is essentially a miracle that God looks at us and says, I will not define you. I refuse to define you by what you have done negatively. But I will graciously forgive and forget and release you from your debts. It's incredible. And if it's all we said, that'd be enough. But I think that the story of St. Olga demands that we go a little further. And we consider a little bit more. You see, if you think about the story of St. Olga was the queen regent of an entire nation. As we learned, nobody can tell Olga no. She has wealth. She has power. Anything she may not have, she can get. There was no more comfortable person on planet Earth, potentially, than Olga, Viking princess and queen regent of Kiev Rus. She had absolutely everything. Humanly speaking, she had everything. And yet when she hears the gospel, when she interacts with Christians, when she considers who she is and what she has, and who she's not and what she doesn't have, like that, she makes the decision to change everything. I mean, think that through. And she didn't do it out of peer pressure. She didn't do it out of cultural expectation. She didn't do it because somebody told her she needed to. She did it because she wanted to. She had absolutely everything, and yet when she heard the gospel, she realized that she was still missing something. The only reason Olga would have been baptized, there's two reasons, really. Because first of all, that Christianity is really great. This gospel is as good a news as we've talked about. But there's a second thing we usually don't talk about, and that's this, that sin is not all that it's cracked up to be. You know, we've established that Olga was sinful in crazy ways, and we look at her, and it seems like her sin worked out for her. You know, her sinfulness, her anger and revenge and violence and murder, it worked out. Like she won the game. But it didn't. And you see, we often think about sin in positive terms. I mean, how many of us have ever seen, you know, a recipe or something for like a dessert, and it's called sinfully delicious? Or how often have we ever said something, we've experienced something, we thought, man, that felt so good, or that was so much fun that it's got to be a sin. You know, we think about sin as like these things that are fun things God has told us not to do. They're really fun and they're really nice, but God's just told us no. And so the reason we repent from the fun things God has told us not to do is because otherwise God will punish us. That's the way we think about sin. That sin's a good thing that works out. I mean, think about like every movie you have ever watched that includes a hero and a bad guy. The bad guy is always extremely wealthy. They always have a giant lair hideout. They always have a ton of disposable henchmen. They always have all the women they could ever want. They always have fancy cars and as much money as they, like, their sinfulness. They're bad guys, but materially speaking, humanly speaking, they're always winning. And so there's part of us that thinks, okay, if we sin, we win in life. Sin works out. God's told us not to do these fun things. And so we're not going to do the fun things because we don't want to anger God. We don't want to be punished. But sin is really fun. But Olga's story teaches us something very different. You see, Olga had everything. She wanted for nothing. And she'd gotten it all by sinning. And literally the first time she heard the gospel, she said, I want that. Olga was not at peace. Olga was not content. She may have had a degree of happiness that all of her wealth and power and money could buy, but there was a massive gaping hole missing in who she was at her core, that she needed Christ to be part of. And you know, her story mirrors what we see in the scriptures about sinful people. You see, the most notorious sinners in the Old Testament are probably Adam and Eve, right? Like they're the first original sin, Adam and Eve. Think about the story of Adam and Eve. God tells Adam and Eve, the very first people, that they should not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you'll notice he doesn't say, if you do, I will kill you. It's not what he says. He doesn't say, if you do, I will punish you. It's not what he says. God tells them, if you eat from this tree, you will surely die. According to God, as he told Adam and Eve, there was an inherent natural consequence. If they sinned, they would be in pain. If they sinned, they would hurt. If they sinned, they would die. Sin had a natural consequence of pain and suffering and dying. And that's mirrored in the New Testament. Maybe the most famous sinner in the New Testament is probably Judas Iscariot, right? If you think about like the worst dude in the New Testament, it's probably Judas, the guy who sells out Jesus. The best friend of Jesus who sells him for not very much money. What happened to Judas? Do we see any divine retribution or punishment there? We don't. What we see is Judas recognizes that what he did killed his friend. That what he did condemned an innocent man. And he tries to make it right, and he can't. He goes and he tries to fix it, and the Pharisees laugh at him. And his guilt and his conscience, his emotional well-being just deteriorates. And so Judas commits suicide. There was a natural, inherent consequence for his sin. We think about sin as the fun things God doesn't want us to do, but the truth of the matter is the scriptures teach us that sin, that's the thing that God tells us not to do because God understands we will be hurt by that sin. Those who sin have the natural consequence of suffering and being in pain. Olga suffered and was in pain, and that's why she was baptized. And Adam and Eve suffered and were in pain, and Judas suffered and was in pain. And the idea we get from sin is it's not a fun thing that God tells us not to do. And it's not something that we'll enjoy, and the reason we don't do it is because we're afraid God will punish us. But instead, that sin is its own punishment. And the world we live in, where queens can be like Olga, that can be really hard to imagine. And that's where we have to have the humility to say, you know what? I'm going to trust that God has a better idea about this than I do. I might look at the world and say, hey, the sinners all win. But what God is saying is, no, they're not. That's not victory. There's an inherent cost. There are inherent consequences to doing that which is against God's will. To sin is to bring suffering and pain to your life, to someone else's life, and to the entire world. That's why in the New Testament we read over and over that we are victims of sin, that sin is this force that affects all of us because we bring pain into the world. And now that we say that, we can understand what forgiveness really is. Forgiveness is God simply saying, I refuse to add on to your misery. You're already in pain. So I refuse to add to it. I will not make you suffer anymore. I will not give you any more pain than you already have. I will release you from that debt. I will give you a new start, a new future. And I will not keep a record of your wrongs. Because God is love. Love is forgiving. That means that God, a very strange God, is forgiving. This morning, we're in our, I don't even know, 4th or 5th week, something like that, of our series called A Strange God and a Strange People. And as we consider sin and we think about what that means, and we think about forgiveness, we learn a beautiful truth about who God is and who we should be. Our 5th lesson, a strange God is this. God the end of it. God stops the cycle, forgives us, and that's that. Great. But you see, if a sermon ends on a Sunday morning with just a attaboy preacher and if that makes me feel good, I haven't done my job. This is something that we need to take with us every day, including our Tuesday afternoons and our Thursday evenings and all the random days in between. And what we're told in the scriptures is that because we are forgiven, we are called to forgive. And that's tough. Like, there may not be a tougher thing in this world than forgiving those who have wronged us. I think it's significant that part of the Lord's Prayer, we ask for forgiveness of God. But also, there's this subtle undertone of, I am forgiven as I forgive. And it's as we pray, it's like we're asking for divine help. Because to forgive is truly something that God has to empower us to do. But I think also God motivates us through the truth. And when we recognize the truth about sin, what we recognize is this. Every person who has ever hurt you was also hurting. Every pain inflicted upon you, every sin against you was committed by somebody who was sinning, by someone who also had pain. Each time you suffered at the hands of someone else suffering. And that's what's beautiful about forgiveness with God is God saying, okay, I will not add to your misery. You are already in pain. You're already hurting. I forgive you. I will let that go. I will not add to that. God declares through his actions he is better than sin. And then he calls us to be the same. And when we recognize that forgiveness is simply us being better than sin, we are saying, okay, you're hurting, you're suffering, and I will not add to it. If sin is that which hurts us, if sin is that which hurts other people, then by forgiving, we are simply saying that I am better than sin. I will not hurt others. I will not put any more suffering into the world. And we call that forgiveness. And it's still not easy. But I think when we think of it in those terms, when we start seeing sin for what it is, and we see God for who he is, and we see forgiveness for what it is, well, then it only makes sense that we want to live a life better than sin, right? Like, I want to be better than that which inflicts suffering. That's what Olga wanted. That's why she repented and was baptized. That's what Adam and Eve in their story and the life of Judas, that's what they're teaching us. That we are called to be better than vessels of hurt and suffering and pain. Because we're called to forgive. This morning, the musicians are going to come forward. They're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation each and every week to accept Christ on his offer. And what that means is to accept Christ and his forgiveness, to trust that he does love us and he does care. And because of that, he does say, you know what? I will stop the cycle of pain here. I will forgive. And he calls us to do the same for other people, for ourselves. Very often, it's the hardest one. God calls us to be people who repent each and every day. The Bible teaches that the first time we make the decision, there's a symbolic act with that in baptism. We go down into the water. It's our old selves being put to death. We get out of the water. It's our new selves being born again. The Bible promises it's not a command. It's not a do this or I'll punish you. I can't describe how wrong that is about God, but it's a promise that we're made brand new. If you've never made the decision, we got a nice warm baptistry. All sorts of people can do it. Let's talk. If you're already a believer in Christ, we're looking for a perfect church home. This place is not it, but we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up while we do it. And we want to be people who end the cycle of pain. God has forgiven us. God has decided that he will not add to our misery. And he has said, for you, you choose to do the same.